Chapter 1, No One Will Take Them. The third door shut in Della Hartwell's face before she had finished speaking. She stood on the porch of the Ackerley ranch with the cold already coming up out of the ground through her thin soles, and she made herself keep her chin level while she listened to the bolts slide home on the other side of the wood. Behind her, down in the rutted yard, her 4 boys had gone still the way rabbits go still, and that stillness was worse than any noise they could have made. "Ma," said Wheeze. "Ma, he wasn't even going to feed us." "Hush," Della said. She did not turn around yet. She needed the door to be a door a moment longer and not her own children's faces, because if she looked at them now she was not certain her legs would hold her. She had counted on the ride out the things she still had. A wedding ring she would not sell while there was breath in her. A trunk of mended clothes, 41 cents, which had been 63 that morning before she paid the man with the wagon on the strength of a rumor that the Ackerleys wanted a woman to cook and keep house. They had wanted a woman. They had not wanted a woman with 4 boys hanging off her like burrs, and Mr. Ackerley had said so with his hand already on the latch. No one will take them. She had heard it 3 times now, in 3 different mouths, dressed up in 3 different kinds of politeness, and it had begun to sound less like an opinion and more like a verdict handed down from somewhere she could not appeal to. She turned around. Tom was standing apart from the others, at the head of the wagon team, holding the near horse's cheek strap as though he meant to fight the animal for it. 13 years old, and already carrying his shoulders like a man who expected a blow and meant to take it standing. Wheeze hovered at his elbow, quick-eyed, working out some scheme behind his freckles the way he always was. Amos had crouched down in the frozen weeds to look at a beetle, because Amos would find a living thing to love in the middle of a burning house. And little Pip, 5 years old and not a word out of him since his father went into the ground, had both arms wrapped around Della's skirt and his face pressed into her hip, so that when she moved him too. "Get up in the wagon," she told them, "all of you. We're going back to town." "To do what?" Tom said. It was not a question. It was a dare, and it was aimed at her, and she understood that he did not mean it for her at all. He meant it for the shut door, and for the man with the wagon who charged them by the mile, and for the whole country that kept telling a boy that his family was a burden nobody would shoulder. But it landed on her because she was the one still standing there. "To think," Della said, "get up." They rode back the long, cold road into Cottonwood Bend, with the light going amber and mean across the flats, and nobody spoke, and Pip fell asleep against her, and she looked out at the mountains turning the color of a bruise and thought about winter. Ruth Baird was pulling in the barrels from the front of the general store when the wagon let them off, and Della watched the storekeeper take in the whole of them, the boys, the trunk, the set of Della's jaw, and understand it in one look, the way women who had known hardship could read it on other women like print. "Come inside a minute," Ruth said. "It's turning." "I can't buy anything, Ruth. I'll be honest with you, I can't." "I didn't say buy, I said come inside." The store was warm, at least, and it smelled of coffee and leather and the licorice in the jar on the counter, and Ruth put a peppermint in each boy's hand from that jar without making a show of it and jerked her head at the stove for them to go stand by it. Amos said thank you. The others were too tired. "They turned you off at Ackerley's," Ruth said low, so it stayed between the 2 women. "That's 3, Della let the number sit there. "Boarding house wants us out by Saturday. She's been kind about it longer than she had to be, but there's a drummer coming needs the room, and money is money." She pressed the back of her wrist against her eyes just for a second, then took it away. "I've written to my husband's brother in Kansas. If he answers and if he wants us, that's spring. That's a whole winter from now, Ruth. I don't have a winter. I've got till Saturday and 41 cents. Ruth was quiet. She wiped the counter that did not need wiping. Then she said, in a careful voice, the voice of someone laying a plank across bad ice, "There's one more." "One more what?" "One more man who might take on a woman and boys for the work of it, out west of here up the creek. The Barcy," Ruth folded the cloth over and over. "Ezra Calloway. You didn't say his name the first day when I came in asking. You gave me Ackerley and Purdom and the Lees. You didn't say his name." "No," Ruth admitted, "I didn't." "Why not?" Ruth looked at her a long moment, and something passed over the older woman's face that Della could not name, not scorn, which she had grown used to, but something more like shame at other people's account. "Folks say things about him," Ruth said. "That's all. I'll tell you plain so you hear it from someone who likes him and not from someone who don't. He came back from the war marked. There's a scar down the one side of his face, they say from a saber, though I never asked, and he never offered, and he took something in the leg that left him a limp he'll carry to his grave. He keeps to himself out there. Doesn't come to church, doesn't come to the socials. And this town, being what it is, decided a man who looks like that and lives like that must have something wrong under the skin to match the skin. She set the cloth down. I don't believe it. I've traded with Ezra Calloway 11 years, and he has never once given me a short wait or a hard word or a reason to lock my door. But I'll not send you out there under a lie. They call him a monster in this town, Della, some of them to his face. Della looked at the stove, at the 4 heads bent over 4 peppermints. Is he cruel? She asked. No, Ruth said, and there was no hesitation in it at all. That's the one thing they've never once accused him of, and they'd have found it by now if it was there. Outside, something crashed. Della was through the door before she had decided to move, and what she found was this. Tom flat on his back in the mud of the street with his lip split, and a bigger boy, one of the Purdom sons, thick through the shoulders, 16 if he was a day, standing over him red-faced. And we's gripping the back of that boy's coat trying to haul him off with all 80 pounds he owned, and Amos shrieking, and a knot of grown men on the walk in front of the saloon watching it like it was a thing put on for their supper. He said Pa was a coward, Tom spat, getting up, swinging before he was even upright. He said we come from nothing and we'd go back to. Tom, Della got between them with both hands out. The Purdom boy backed off, smirking, wiping his knuckles on his coat, and one of the men on the walk laughed and said something about asterisk wild ones, said it just loud enough. The way a man does when he wants you to hear it and wants to be able to say he never spoke to you at all. Widow ought to keep her pack chained, the man said to the fellow beside him. That's the 3rd fight this week. No wonder no one'll board 'em. Della felt the whole street looking. She felt every window of the town of Cottonwood Bend turned toward her 4 sons and finding them wanting, and she felt the old hot shame come up her neck. And under it, deeper, hotter, the thing that had kept her upright through the fever that took her husband and the auction that took the farm and every shut door since. It was not pride exactly. Pride was a thing you could afford. This was closer to the bottom of the well. She did not answer the man. She had learned that answering was what they wanted. She put her arm around Tom, who was shaking, and said quietly, only for her boys, in the wagon. We don't have the wagon no more, Ma, we said. The man left. Then we walked to the livery, and I hire another one. With what? Tom's voice cracked right down the middle, 13 years old and furious and terrified, and he looked at her with his split lip and his father's eyes. With what, Ma? We don't got it. I heard you and the store lady. I heard all of it. So he had heard. He had heard asterisk monster asterisk then, along with everything else. Della crouched down in the cold street in front of her eldest, in front of all of them, in the mud with the town watching, and she did not care any more who watched. There's a man out at the Barcy, she said steadily so that all 4 of them would have it clear. West up the creek, he might have work for me and beds for you and food and a roof that's ours to keep through the winter for the earning of it. Folks say he's frightening to look at. I'm telling you now so it doesn't jump out at you cold. She looked at each of them in turn, Tom, Wheeze, Amos, and last at Pip, who had come to press against her again. A man's face is the thing that happened to him. It is not the man. Do you understand me? Amos nodded, because Amos would nod at any creature. The others said nothing, which was as close to yes as she was going to get. She hired the wagon with 30 of her 41 cents and did not let herself count what that left, and they went out toward the Barcy in the last of the light, the boys grumbling and cold and afraid in the bed behind her, the road climbing along the creek that muttered and shone in the dusk. She had never in her life gone to a strange man's door with her hand out. She turned the words over and could not make them lie flat. Then the ranch came up out of the twilight, a low house, a barn leaning tired against the hill, a corral, and she saw him. He was out along the fence line, alone, a big man made bigger by the long coat, working in the failing light because there was no one to work in his stead. He was driving a split-rail home, and even from here she could see it in the way he moved. The drag and hitch of the bad leg, the way he braced through it and swung anyhow, the way pain had been folded so far down into his walking that it had become just how he walked. He straightened at the sound of the wagon and turned, and the last of the west light fell across the side of his face, and she saw the scar then, a pale seam from brow to jaw, drawing the whole side of him tight. Behind her in the wagon bed, all 4 of her boys went silent at once, even Pip. It was the silence from the Ackerley porch, the rabbit silence, and it should have frightened her. It didn't, because the man at the fence did not put them all down, and he did not step back, and he did not do any of the things a monster in a story would do. He set the tool head down against the rail, and he took his hat off, took it off, to a wagon full of strangers, the way a man does for company he means to receive. And he stood there in the cold with his ruined face bare to them and waited, courteous and still, for her to come and state her business. Della climbed down. She told the boys to stay, and for once they obeyed. She crossed the frozen yard toward the porch, and she heard him come up behind her, unhurried, the maul left where it was. She stepped up onto the boards. She lifted her hand to knock, though there was no longer any need to knock, since the man himself was 10 feet off and watching her, and she held it there a breath, her cold fist raised against the dark wood of the last door in the county that had not yet been shut against her children. Then she knocked anyway, because she did not know how else to begin. Chapter 2, The Only Open Gate. The door opened before her knuckles ever touched the wood. Della Hartwell drew her hand back as if the boards had gone hot. The man filling the frame was taller than he'd looked out at the fence line, broad through the shoulder and still as a fence post himself, and the lamplight behind him threw the whole ruined side of his face into hard relief. The scar ran from his brow to the corner of his jaw, a pale river through a country of stubble, pulling one eyelid the smallest bit askew. His eyes, though, were steady, gray as creek water in November and steady, and they moved past her without hurry to the 4 boys clustered at the bottom of the steps. She felt them go rigid behind her, felt little Pip press his face into the back of her skirt. "Evenin'," the man said. His voice came out low and unused, the voice of a man who went whole days without needing it. "You've come a long way for the wrong door, I expect." "That depends," Della said, "on whether it's the only one left." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not a smile, an acknowledgement. He looked at her a moment longer, then stepped back and to the side, which she understood after a beat was an invitation to come in out of the cold, and not a thing many men would have offered a strange woman and 4 boys at full dark. "Ezra Calloway," he said, "this is the Barcy what's left of it." "Della Hartwell," she gathered her skirt and her nerve together. "These are my sons, Tom, Wesley, Amos, and Pip, the little one." "I count 4, Ezra said. "You count right." He looked at Tom longest. Tom, 13 and jaw set hard as a horseshoe, stared back with all the challenge he had, which was considerable, daring the man to say the thing every other man had said. Ezra didn't say it. He only held the boy's eyes a moment, the way you'd hold the gaze of a young dog deciding whether to bite, and then he nodded once, as though Tom had passed some test he hadn't known he was sitting. "Come in," Ezra said. "Fire's the one thing I've got plenty of." The main room was spare and clean in the way of a house with no woman in it and no money either. A table, 2 chairs, a bench along the wall, a rifle over the door, a tin of biscuits and a pot of beans keeping warm at the edge of the stove, enough for one man's supper and no more. Della saw all of it in a single sweep, the habit of a woman who had learned to read a household the way a scout reads ground, and what she read was a man scraping bottom, same as she was. "Sit them down," Ezra said, and turned to the stove. "Mr. Calloway." She stayed standing. Pride was the last coin she had, and she meant to spend it honest. "I won't waste your evening. We were turned off 3 ranches this week and out of the boarding house by Saturday. I've no money left. What I have is a strong back, and I keep a house better than any woman in that town that wouldn't take us. I can cook, mend, salt, meat, keep your books if you've got any, and my boys can work. Tom does a man's day already. I'm not here to beg your charity. I'm here to trade you honest labor for a roof and food, and I'll thank you not to make me say it twice." The words landed in the quiet room and sat there. Behind her, Wesley shifted, and she knew without looking that her second son was already cataloging the exits, the loose latch, the ways a boy might make a place miserable enough that a man would send them off before they could be sent off, so the leaving would be their idea. She'd seen it in him at every door. Ezra set 2 more tins on the table, then a third, then a 4th and a 5th, 6 now where there'd been 1, moving without any fuss at all, as if he'd meant to feed 6 people all along and had simply been waiting on them to arrive. "You keep books," he said. "I do." "Then you'll know inside a week the Barcy can't pay what a keeping woman's worth." He ladled beans, even portions, the biggest to Tom. "I'll tell you plain so you can't say I lied you into it. I've got a note at the bank in town and a bad feeling about who's smiling at it. The wage I can offer you is small, and it's slow, and some weeks it may be a side of bacon and a promise." He set the ladle down. That's the truth of my house. You've told me the truth of yours. Now we're even. Della's throat did something unexpected, and she mastered it. Why, she said, would a man take on 6 mouths he can't feed? Ezra Calloway looked at her, and then at the boys, and then at the door as though he could see clear through it to the town beyond and the miles of cold between. Because the same town that shut its gates on you, he said, shut them on me a long while back, for this. He touched the scar one finger without shame or apology, the way another man might touch his hat. They called me a hero when I came home carried on a board, called me something else when they saw what carrying 6 men out of the fire had made of my face. A man learns which side of a closed gate he's on. He pulled out the bench for Pip, who would not come until Della sat first. I know what it is to be turned away for a thing you can't help. I won't do it to somebody else. Eat. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Amos, 8 years old and hollow-cheeked, slid onto the bench and picked up his tin and ate like a boy who'd forgotten there was any other way to be, and that broke the spell. They fell to. Ezra ate standing at the stove a little apart, watching them without seeming to, and when Pip finally peeled loose from Della's side long enough to reach for a biscuit, Della saw the man's eyes go to the child and stay a moment, soft in that hard, ruined face, before he looked away and let the boy be. There's a bunkhouse, Ezra said when the tins were scraped clean. Roof sound, stove draws. It'll sleep the boys warm. Ma'am, you'll take the small room off the kitchen. It's got a door with a bolt on the inside, and I'll thank you to use it, not because you'll need to, but so you'll sleep. He said it plainly, no color in it, and somehow that was worth more than any promise a smoother man might have made. We start at first light. Cattle don't keep town hours. Tom stood up from the bench. We don't need looking after, he said, the words too loud in the small room. I keep this family, not you. Della opened her mouth, but Ezra had already turned, unhurried, to face the boy square. I can see that, he said. You've kept 'em through 3 ranch doors and a town full of cold shoulders, and you've still got all 4 sitting here fed. That's more than most men twice your years could show for it. He held out his hand, plain as trade. I'm not looking to take the job. I'm looking to hire on under you. This ranch needs more men than it's got, and you're the first one through my gate in a year I'd want at my back. That's suit. Tom stared at the offered hand. Della watched her son's whole guarded face war with itself, the fury he'd worn like armor since his father went into the ground trying to find a place to set itself down. He did not take the hand, but he didn't spit on it either. He gave a short, hard nod and jammed his fists in his pockets and looked at the floor, and for Tom that was very nearly surrender. Ezra let the hand fall easy, no offense taken. Bunkhouse is the low building past the well, he said. Lanterns hung inside the door. Later, when the boys had been marched out through the cold, and Della had lit the little room off the kitchen and heard, unmistakably, the 4 of them not sleeping but murmuring low in the dark like conspirators. She came back out for the water bucket and found Ezra at the table with a lamp turned low and a ledger open under his hand. She stopped in the doorway. He did not hide it, but he didn't invite her look either, and she saw more than he'd have chosen for her to see. Columns in a careful, blunt hand, and at the bottom a figure ringed twice in pencil, and beside it a date, and the date was close. She saw the way his thumb rested against the ringed number. She saw a man doing sums he already knew the answer to, and taking on 5 more people anyway. You could have told us no, she said quietly. It would have been the sensible thing. Ezra closed the ledger without hurry. Sensible, he said, is how that town sleeps at night. I've tried it, doesn't suit me. He turned the lamp down another notch. Get your rest, Mrs. Hartwell, morning's early. She took her bucket and her strange, unfamiliar feeling, something that had been folded up small and hard in her chest for a long time, easing open a fraction. And she went to her room and slid the inside bolt, not from fear, but because a man had told her she was allowed to. She was near asleep when she heard the horses. Not thunder, just the wrong sound, the loose complaining creak of a paddock gate swinging free that ought to have been latched, and then hooves shifting, testing, a horse discovering it could walk where it hadn't been able to a minute before. She was up into the window in her shift, and she saw the pale shapes drifting out of the open gate into the yard, and she saw, already crossing the ground at that uneven, driving limp lantern swinging, the man of the house. She got her shawl and went out. By the time she reached the paddock, Ezra had the first horse by the halter, murmuring to it, walking it back through the gate with a patience that never wavered even as his bad leg took the cold ground badly. He had 2 in before she could be of use, the 3rd by the time she got the gate ready to swing. He said nothing about how the latch, which she had watched him set that very evening, had come to be lifted clean off its hook and laid careful in the dirt where no horse's nose could have put it. She said it for him, Wesley. Maybe, Ezra said. He worked the last horse through and dropped the loop of the latch back over its hook, then thoughtfully bent his stiff frame and found a bit of wire in the dark and twisted it round the post so the loop couldn't lift on its own. Or maybe a gate that wanted looking at. He straightened, breathing careful against the pain, and looked toward the bunkhouse, where a small face had appeared at the black window and vanished the instant his lantern turned that way. "He's testing whether I'll come with a strap," Ezra said, not to her exactly, more to the cold night. "They all are. Somebody taught him a man's answer to trouble is a raised hand." "Their father wasn't cruel," Della said, stung. "He just died, and the men after at the ranches, the schoolmaster." She stopped. "I figured as much." Ezra hung the lantern on the post. In its light, the scar was a shadow, and his eyes were only tired. "You go on in, ma'am. It's handled. It'll be handled tomorrow, too, and the day after, however long it takes him to run out of things to try." He looked at the window where the boy had been. "I've got more patience than they've got tricks. They just don't know it yet." He said it without heat, without complaint, a plain fact stated to the dark, and Della Hartwell went back inside past the low lamp and the closed ledger, and lay a long while awake, listening to the uneven fall of his boots as he made one more circuit of his failing ranch, and thought that she had knocked on the wrong door at every house in the county, and only now, at the last one, the one they'd warned her about, had she finally knocked on the right. Chapter 3, The Testing. The war began before breakfast. Ezra Calloway had risen in the blue dark, as he always did, and by the time the sun cleared the ridge he had learned that the boys of Della Hartwell were not going to make his life simple. He found the first sign of it when he swung the saddle onto the sorrel mare and reached beneath her belly for the cinch. The strap had been loosened in the night, not slipped, but deliberately worked back through the buckle so it would hold just long enough to fool a careless man and then let go the moment he put his weight in the stirrup. He stood a while with his hand on the leather, and he did not curse. A careless man would have swung up, and the saddle would have rolled, and he would have gone down hard on the packed earth of the yard with a horse dancing over him. A careless man with a bad leg might have broken something that did not mend. Ezra tightened the cinch slow, checked the latigo, and looked toward the bunkhouse where a curtain twitched and went still. "Morning," he said to no one to the window. He did not raise his voice. By noon there had been more. A pail of milk gone over in the dust with a boot print pressed neatly into the spill. The woodpile he had stacked square knocked into a scatter. The handle of the good axe smeared with bacon grease so it would turn in a man's grip. Each thing was a small cruelty, and each was aimed, and Ezra met each the same way. He set it right with his hands and said nothing that could be carried back as a victory. Della found him at the trough, scrubbing grease off the axe handle with sand and lye, and her face was the color of ash. "Mr. Calloway?" She had her hands knotted in her apron, and her chin was up, which he was learning meant she was bracing for a blow. "Whatever they've done, I'll see it made right. Take it from my wage, all of it if you have to." "Nothing here needs paying for," Ezra said. "There will be more." She said it flat, like a woman reading her own sentence. "I know my sons. When they decide to break a thing, they break it clean through. Every ranch we came to, every schoolmaster, it was a week, sometimes less, before they were shown the road. They're testing how long you'll." "I know what they're doing." He set the axe against the trough. "You don't have to explain your boys to me, ma'am." She looked at him then, really looked, and he watched her try to find the trick in it, the catch under the kindness, and fail. It seemed to trouble her more than anger would have. The worst of it came at dusk, and it came for him personally. He was pulling off his boot at the bunkhouse step. He had told the boys they might sleep in the loft of the barn where it was warmer, and kept the bunkhouse for himself, close to the animals, when his stocking toe found something that was not the toe of his boot. Cool, dry, moving. Ezra went very still. He had learned stillness in the war, learned it in a shell hole with men dying to his left and right, and he called on it now. He eased his foot back out of the boot slow as creeping frost. The snake came with it, poured out onto the boards, a bull snake near 3 feet of it, thick and cross at being carried in the dark. Not a rattler. A boy who knew snakes had chosen it, no fangs to fear, only the horror of the thing against bare skin in the black. Amos, he thought, the one who watched the animals. Only a boy who loved them would know which kind wouldn't kill. He caught the snake behind the head the way his own grandfather had taught him, carried it out past the corral, and set it down gentle in the grass. "Go on," he told it. "You did your part." When he turned back, Tom was standing in the barn door. The eldest, 13 and built like a fence post, all sharp corners and fury with his dead father's jaw and his mother's proud neck. He had a look on him that Ezra had seen on men twice his age, the look of someone spoiling for the hit, wanting it, because a hit was a thing he understood and this quiet was not. "Well," Tom said, his voice cracked on it and he hated that it cracked. Ezra saw him hate it. "Go on, then." "Go on and what?" "Whip us me, I put it there." A lie, it had been Amos, and they both knew it, but the boy took it on his own shoulders, and something in Ezra marked that even as the boy snarled at him. "That's what you're building up to. Every man builds up to it. Get it done so I don't have to keep waiting on it." Ezra stood in the yard with his boot in his hand and the dark coming down, and for a moment he was quiet the way a deep well is quiet. "Your ma cook supper?" he asked. Tom blinked. "What?" "Supper, did she cook it?" She's cooking it." "Then wash up." Ezra turned toward the bunkhouse. "A man doesn't sit down to a good woman's table with snake dirt on his hands. That goes for you and it goes for me." He heard nothing behind him. He did not look back, but he knew the boy had not moved for a long time, and he let him have that. Supper was quiet. Della had made a stew that near broke Ezra's heart. It was so good, and the boys ate like young wolves and watched him over their spoons. Little Pip, the 5-year-old who had not yet said a word in Ezra's hearing, sat pressed to his mother's side and ate with one fist knotted in her sleeve. Ezra did not look at him too long. He had learned that with skittish things, you let them study you, and you did not study them back until they were ready. It was after the plates were cleared that the sugar came out. Wesley, 11, the schemer, the one with the quick, clever eyes, had done a thing to the coffee. Ezra took one swallow and knew it. Salt where the sugar should be, a dose of it, enough to gag a man. Across the table, Wheeze was watching with the poorly hid glee of a boy who had laid a trap and waited on it to spring. Della had not seen. She was at the basin with her back turned. Ezra drank the cup down, all of it. Slow, even swallows, his scarred face giving away nothing, and set the empty cup on the wood. "Fine coffee," he said. Wheeze's mouth fell open, and Pip's silent Pip made a sound. A small one, half a giggle, strangled before it got loose, one hand flying up over his mouth. It was the first sound Ezra had heard from him that wasn't fear. Della turned from the basin. "What's funny?" "Nothing, ma'am," Ezra said. He picked up the pot and refilled Wheeze's cup and his own, and under the table Wheeze had gone red to his ears, caught not by the strap, but by the sheer confounding wrongness of a man who would drink a cup of salt to keep a boy out of trouble with his mother. Boy poured, good and strong. Later, when the young ones were sent to the loft, Della caught him on the porch. The night was cold and getting colder, winter breathing down out of the hills. "You know it was Wesley," she said. "The coffee, I saw your face. No, I didn't. That's the trouble. I never can. But I know that boy. You knew and you drank it and you let me think." Her voice went thin. "Why? Why would you take that on yourself?" Ezra was quiet a moment, looking out at the dark shape of his failing land. "Because it wasn't the coffee he wanted," he said. "It was to see what I'd do. They all want to see, whether I'm one more thing that's going to hurt them." He shifted his weight off the bad leg. "A boy who's been hit enough gets so he'd rather bring the hit on quick, on his own terms, than wait for it to come when he's not looking. Your Tom's like that. He's been waiting to get whipped since the day you drove in that gate, because at least then he'd know the shape of me." Della had gone still against the porch rail. "They're not bad, Mrs. Hartwell," Ezra said. "I've seen bad. Bad doesn't take a snake it knows won't bite. Bad doesn't pour salt and then hold its breath to see if it got a man in trouble with his mama. Your boys aren't wild. They're guarding themselves. Somewhere along the road somebody taught them that everything soft gets taken, so they got hard first to save you the grief of watching them get took." He looked at her. "That's not wildness. That's 4 boys standing guard over the one thing they've got left, which is you." He did not know what he had said until he saw her face come apart. She turned away from him fast, both hands pressed to her mouth, her shoulders shaking without sound, and Ezra looked out at the dark and gave her the same courtesy he'd given her son. He did not watch her be undone. "Cold out here," he said, when she had gathered herself. "I'll bank the fire." The break came the next morning, and it came from the 8-year-old. There was a calf down in the near pen, a heifer's first, come early and come wrong, gone weak and shivering in the cold with its mother nosing it and lowing. Ezra had been up half the night with it, and the thing was failing. He carried it into the warm of the barn on the good side of his body, and when he turned there was Amos in the straw, the animal lover, the one who'd chosen a gentle snake, staring at the calf with his whole heart naked on his face. Ezra could have sent him off. Instead, he knelt slow, easing the bad leg down, and looked at the boy over the calf's laboring flank. "This one's yours now," he said. Amos's eyes came up. "Sir, can't watch it and mind the herd both. It needs milk warmed and given by hand every hour, day and night. Needs turning so its lungs don't fill. Needs a body that'll notice if it goes down or comes up." Ezra laid the calf in the straw between them. "I'm trusting you with a life, son. It might die anyhow, that's the way of new things in the cold. But it won't die alone, and it won't die untended, not if you're the one over it. You up to it?" The boy looked at the calf. He looked at the scarred man kneeling in the straw who had not once, in 3 days of being tormented, raised his hand or his voice. And something in Amos's face, some braced and waiting thing, gave way all at once. "I'm up to it," Amos whispered. He put his small hand on the calf's ribs like he'd seen Ezra do. "I won't let it die." "I know you won't," Ezra said, and rose and left the boy to his charge. It was late that afternoon, mending the pen rail Weeze had loosened, that Ezra felt eyes on him. He didn't turn. He set the rail, drove the peg, and worked the way he always worked, steady, quiet, favoring the leg. The old torn muscle in his hip lit up with a slow fire that never fully went out. Not since a June morning near a river with a name he'd spent 10 years trying to forget. When he'd gone back 3 times into fire for men who couldn't walk and carried them out one at a time, and caught the round that laid his face open on the last trip. He did not complain of it. He had never once, in front of these people, made a sound about the pain. He set his teeth against it and did the work. By the barn, half hid in shadow, Tom watched him. The boy had come meaning to find one more thing to break, Ezra guessed. But he had gone quiet, and he was not looking at the fence. He was looking at how a man carries a hurt he won't put down, and does the day's work anyway, and never asks a soul to pity him for it. Tom's jaw was still set hard. His eyes were still cold. He was not one, not by half, not yet. But he was watching, and for the first time Ezra thought the boy was watching something he did not know how to hate. Chapter 4, one at a time. The sick calf lived, and that was how it started. Amos had sat up 2 nights with it in the corner of the barn, a lantern low and a rag soaked in the warm gruel Ezra had shown him how to mix. On the 3rd morning, the little red heifer stood on its own splayed legs and beauted the boy's chest for more, and Amos came running to the house, straw in his hair and his face lit like Christmas. "She's up," he said, breathless, forgetting to be sullen. "Mr. Calloway, she's up and she's hungry, and she near knocked me flat." Ezra was at the table with his coffee, and he did not smile the way another man might have, big and quick. He only set down the cup and looked at the boy a long moment, the scar pulling white along his jaw the way it did when something moved in him. "That's your doing," he said. "Not mine. I told you what to do. You're the one stayed up and did it." Amos stood very still, as if the words might spook and run off. "It was mostly me." "It was all you." Ezra rose, favoring the bad leg, and reached for his hat. "A calf knows who kept it warm. She'll follow you now. That's a thing you earned, and nobody can take it back." Della, spoon gone still, watched her middle boy walk out 3 inches taller than he'd come in. She had not seen Amos proud of anything since before his father died. The town had called him wild, the schoolmaster hopeless. This scarred man had handed him a dying animal and called him a doctor, and the boy had believed it. She turned back to the eggs, so Ezra would not see her eyes. Wesley was a harder nut, because Weeze was clever and knew it, and cleverness with nowhere to go turns mean. He'd been the architect of most of the mischief, the salt in the sugar tin, the loosened cinch, the snake in Ezra's boot that first week. Ezra had answered every one of it without the strap, and it had left the boy uneasy, the way a locked door left unlocked will unsettle a thief. The old grist mill by the creek had not turned in 2 years. Ezra took Weeze down on a gray afternoon and stood him before the seized wheel and the tangle of rusted gearing and cracked belting. "I can't make it run," Ezra said plainly. "Never had the head for it. My father built it and it died with him." He looked at the boy sidewise. "You've got the head for it. I've watched you take apart every latch on this place, so take this apart. See if there's a way to bring it back." Weeze eyed him with the flat suspicion of a boy waiting for the trick. "You're setting me to a thing that can't be done, so when it don't work you can say I failed." No, I'm setting you to a thing I can't do, hoping you can. There's a difference. If it beats you, it beat me first and beats me still. No shame in that. He laid a hand on the cold iron. But I don't think it'll beat you. The boy said nothing. But the next morning he was gone before breakfast, and Della found him at noon under the mill on his back in the mud, arms greased to the elbow, muttering about the pitch of the teeth. He would not come to dinner. For the first time in a year, Wesley Hartwell had something worth being late for. Little Pip was the one who broke her heart, and the one Ezra reached without a single word. The boy had not spoken since the burying. 5 years old and silent as a stone, he clung to Della's skirts and watched the world from behind them with great dark eyes that missed nothing. The town had whispered that two, touched, simple, and Della had wanted to claw their faces. Ezra never pushed the child. He only let Pip trail him the way a shadow trails and asked nothing. In the long evenings after chores, while the others washed up, he sat by the hearth with his knife and a block of soft pine, let the shavings curl onto the floor, and did not once look to see if the boy was watching. The boy was always watching. It took the better part of a week. Then one evening Ezra set the finished thing on the hearthstone within reach and went on carving as though he'd forgotten it. A little horse, no bigger than a man's hand, legs braced and neck arched, so lifelike the firelight made it seem to toss its head. Pip crept out from the skirts. He picked it up in both hands like something holy and turned it to the light. And in the hush, in a voice rusty and small from long disuse, he said one word. Horse. The room stopped. Della's mending fell to her lap. Tom went still. Amos's mouth came open. Ezra did not startle it. He did not sweep the child up or make a fuss. He only looked down at Pip with that grave, gentle steadiness and said low, "That's right, that's a horse." "He's yours." Pip pressed the little carving to his chest and looked up at the scarred face above him with no fear in him at all. "Mine," he said. "Yours," Ezra agreed. Della put her hand over her mouth and wept without a sound, and could not have said whether it was grief or joy, because after so long they had come to feel like the same thing. Later, when the boys were bedded down and Pip asleep with the horse still fisted in one hand, she found Ezra on the porch. 2 years, she said, unsteady. Doctors, my sister, the church, women, they all had their notions, and you carved him a horse. He'd have talked when he was ready, Ezra said. He just needed something worth talking about, and to know the man he said it to wouldn't laugh. You didn't do it to win him. No, ma'am, he turned the knife over in his hands. A boy ought to have a horse of his own, even a wooden one, that's all. She looked at him then, really looked, the ruined side of his face turned toward her, unhidden in the starlight and the tired kindness in it. Told all her life that this was a man to fear, and here he sat carving toys for a broken child, asking nothing back. They said no woman would have you, she said before she could stop the words. In town, that's what they said. His jaw tightened. They did. They were fools. For a moment he didn't move, then quiet. They said things about you too, Mrs. Hartwell, that you were used up. Widowed with 4 wild boys hung round your neck, that no man would take on the freight of you. His eyes came up to hers. They were fools twice then. The air between them went taut as fence wire. Her hand rested on the rail an inch from his. Neither moved it away, and neither closed the gap, and both looked out at the dark yard as if hope were a thing that had to be approached sideways or it would bolt. But she was a woman who'd learned that wanting a thing was the surest way to lose it, and he was a man who'd learned the same, and so they let it be enough for now that neither of them had gotten up to go. The mornings grew shorter, and the suppers grew longer. That was the change she marked most. In the first hard days, Ezra had eaten fast and left the moment his plate was clean, as though he had no right to linger in his own house. Now he stayed. Della's cooking had brought the place back to life, bread rising in the warm kitchen, stew that filled the house with onions and thyme, pie when the wild plums came in. The boys fought over the crusts and told tall stories. Amos gave a full medical report on the calf, and Ezra sat at the head of the table with his coffee going cold and did not leave. One night Amos asked him how he'd gotten the scar, blunt as only an 8-year-old can be, and Della started to hush him, but Ezra raised a hand. It's a fair thing to ask, he said. The war. A shell came into the trench where my unit was. I got some of the men out before the second one. The face and the leg is what it cost. He said it flat, the way a man reads a bill of sale. For a while folks called it brave. Then they got a look at what was left of me and decided a thing that looks like this couldn't be brave after all. Easier to be afraid of it. I ain't afraid of it, Amos said. I know you're not, said Ezra. And for the first time Della saw something in his eyes come loose that had been bound tight since the day they'd arrived. Even Tom, by the door, always by the door, the angry man of a house that had lost its man, did not sneer this time. He watched Ezra work his stiff leg under the table and pour coffee for the little ones and never once complain, and something moved behind the boy's hard face he was not ready yet to name. The trouble rode in a week later on a fine bay horse, wearing a good hat and a wide smile. Della was hanging wash when she saw him come up the lane, a big, prosperous man with silver at his temples and a coat that had never known honest dirt. He drew rein and swept his hat off as courtly as you please. Mrs. Hartwell, I take it. Sela's vein. I run the Circle V over the ridge. His eyes moved over the wash line, the mended shirts, the boys frozen at their chores, and came back to her measuring like a man pricing stock. Neighbors ought to be acquainted. Ezra came out of the barn without hurry, wiping his hands, and put himself easy between Vane and the wash line without seeming to. Vane. Ezra, the smile stayed nailed on. Vane looked out over the yard, the boys, the creek glinting silver at the bottom of the pasture. You've got yourself a regular household, quite a change. He said it pleasant, and it landed like a slap. I'll be plain, times are hard, a place this size, run by one man with a bad leg, and now what, 5 extra mouths, 6? He clicked his tongue. Heavy load, I'd take some of it off your hands, the strays, I mean, the boys. I know a man in the county could put them to real work, board and all. Do you a kindness. The yard went dead quiet. Della's blood ran cold. Little Pip pressed the wooden horse to his chest. Ezra did not raise his voice. He never did. No, he said. Vane's brows lifted, still smiling. Now I'm only trying. You're trying to buy my family off my land like culls out of a pen, Ezra said, and though the words came soft, they had iron in them. Nothing here is for sale. Not the boys, not the widow, not one stone of the Barcy, not that creek you keep looking at. You've got your answer, ride on. For just a moment the smile slipped, and Della saw what was under it, flat and cold and patient as a snake in shade. Then it fixed itself back on. Course, Vane said, gathering his reins. No offense meant, I only worry. Fella overextends himself, takes on more than his ground can carry well. He set the hat back on. Notes come due, land changes hands, happens all the time. He touched the brim to Della. Ma'am. Fine boys you've got. And he turned the bay and rode out easy, in no hurry at all, which was somehow the worst of it. Ezra stood watching the dust till it settled. What did he mean? Della asked low. Notes coming due. Nothing you need carry, Ezra said. But she had run a household on thin coin long enough to know the sound of a man not telling her the whole of a thing, and she filed it away with a cold weight. That afternoon old Marshal Boone rode out, ostensibly to water his horse, and stood a while with Ezra at the corral. Della, bringing coffee, caught the tail of it. Buying up paper all over the valley, Boone was saying, tired. Owns half the town council and a piece of the bank besides. I'm one old man with a tin star, Ezra. I'll do right when the day comes, but his day's coming, and it's coming for you. He drank off the coffee. That water of yours, he wants it bad. Man like that wanting a thing bad, you'd best batten down. Ezra said nothing. But that night he stayed at the table longer than ever, watching his family in the lamplight, Amos talking calves, We's greasy and proud, Pip whispering to a wooden horse, Tom's guard down an inch. Della's face soft in the glow, as though he were counting over everything he owned before a storm, and meant to be sure of every last piece of it before the wind came. Chapter 5, The Man of the House. The mill was fixed and the calf was mending, but Tom Hartwell had not once looked Ezra Calloway in the eye. Ezra had learned to read that in a man. He had known officers who could not meet a gaze and soldiers who would not, and Tom was the second kind, a boy holding a line he did not know how to abandon without dying a little. So Ezra did not push. He waited, the way he waited on the weather, and on the third morning of that clear, cold week he found his chance in the north pasture, where 40 head of cattle needed moving to the creek bottom before the frost took the last of the grass. I could use a hand, Ezra said, not turning from the saddle he was cinching. Not a boy to fetch and carry, a hand, somebody to ride the far side and read the herd back to me. Tom stood in the barn door with his fists in his pockets, 13 years old and already carrying the stoop of a man twice that. Why me? Wheezes quicker. Wheezes quick, Ezra agreed. Quick's for the mill. This wants somebody who won't spook when a steer turns on him. That's a different thing than quick. He swung the saddle blanket over the second horse, the gray mare, the steady one, and stepped back from her. She's yours for the day if you want the work. I'll be honest with you, Tom. I can't run this place short-handed and I can't afford another man's wage. If you ride, we save the grass. If we save the grass, we keep the herd through winter. If we keep the herd, we keep the ranch. He let that sit a moment. I'm not ordering it, I'm asking, it's your say. Something crossed the boy's face, suspicion first, because suspicion came to him quickest of all, and then underneath it, a startled kind of stillness. No man had ever laid the truth of a thing in front of him and left the choosing to him. His father had maybe once before the fever, nobody since. You'd trust me on the far side, Tom said, where you can't see what I'm doing. I'd have to, Ezra said. That's what a partner is. The boy came off the door frame slow, like he expected the offer to be snatched back. It wasn't. Ezra held the mare's bridle while Tom mounted, said nothing about the clumsy way he found the stirrup, and swung up onto his own horse without a wasted motion despite the leg that never let him forget the war. Then he pointed with his chin toward the far tree line, and they rode out together into the white morning. They worked the herd for 3 hours, and Ezra did not raise his voice once. When a steer broke, he did not shout at Tom to head it. He called the cattle's name and let the boy see the shape of the thing and find the answer himself. Twice Tom found it wrong and the steer got past him, and both times Ezra only said, "Next one," and meant it. By the time the sun stood high, the herd was down in the creek bottom, drinking, steam rising off their backs, and Tom Hartwell was flushed and breathing hard and looking at the thing he had helped make. They ate cold biscuit and bacon under a bare cottonwood, the horses cropping what grass was left. For a while neither spoke. Then Tom said, staring at the water, "You keep saying partner." "I do. I never had that, not since Pa," the boy's jaw worked. "After he passed, Ma cried at night when she thought we were sleeping and somebody had to." He stopped, started again lower. "I was 11. She kept saying I was the man of the house now. Every rent day, every time a door shut on us, every ranch that turned us off, I was the man. So I stopped being scared out loud. I stopped being anything out loud, because if I broke, who was gonna hold it?" Ezra set his biscuit down on his knee. He looked at the boy for a long moment, and when he spoke his voice had gone quiet and level as a hand laid flat on a table. "That's too much for a man grown," he said. "It's a sight too much for a boy of 11. You've been carrying a wagon uphill for 2 years, and every soul that watched you do it called it your job." He shook his head slowly. "It was never your job, Tom. It was the world's, and the world put it down on you because you were small and you couldn't say no." Tom's eyes had gone bright and hard. "Somebody had to." "Somebody does," Ezra said. "Me. From here on it's mine. The rent, the door that shuts, the winter, the note the bank holds over this place. You don't lift a pound of it that you don't choose to lift. You can ride the far side of the herd because you're good at it and it makes you proud, and that's a fine thing. But you carry it because you want to, not because there's nobody else." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the scar down his face pale in the cold light. "You get to be a boy again, son." "I've got the rest." Something broke in Tom then. Not loud, the way nothing in him was loud, but total. The line he'd held for 2 years simply gave, and the boy put his face in his hands and shook, and Ezra Calloway did the only thing that was needed. He put his arm around those thin, shaking shoulders and held on, saying nothing, the way you hold a colt through its first thunder, until the storm passed through and out the other side and left the boy emptied and quiet, and for the first time leaning. "All right," Ezra said finally, and it was a benediction. "All right." They rode home in an easier silence than they had ridden out in, and when Della saw them come over the rise together, her eldest sitting straight in the saddle, saying something that made the scarred man beside him tip his head back and laugh, a rusty, unpracticed sound. She stood in the doorway with a dish towel forgotten in her hands and did not trust herself to speak. After that the house changed, and it changed the way spring changes a frozen field, all at once and everywhere. Branding Day came the next week, and it became, against every expectation, a kind of festival. Ezra ran it slow and safe, and he found a piece of it for each of them. Amos worked the salve, and the tally, grave and careful, the animal lover made a healer. We's ran the gate and the count, his cleverness given a lever to push on. Tom rode the cutting horse beside Ezra as an equal, and little Pip, silent Pip, who had spoken his first word only days before, sat up on the top rail with the wooden horse Ezra had carved him clutched in one fist and shrieked with laughter every time a calf kicked. Della carried water and biscuits out to the pen and stood watching 4 boys she had been told all over the territory were wild, unmanageable, ruined, and saw instead 4 boys who were simply, finally happy. On the hot back end of the week, Ezra took them all down to the deep bend of the creek where the water ran green and slow, and he let them swim. He sat on the bank with his boots off and his ruined legs stretched out in the sun, and he watched them dunk each other and holler. And when Weeze dared him in, "Bet the leg won't let you, mister." Ezra went in boots and all and came up roaring and caught the boy under one arm and threw him laughing into the current. Della sat beside him afterward on the warm stones while the boys splashed, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and neither of them moved away. "I haven't heard them laugh like that," she said, "since before their father." "They were always in there," Ezra said. "Somebody just had to quit hitting the door and open it." She looked at his profile, at the scar she no longer saw as a scar, and she almost said the thing that had been rising in her for weeks. She did not, but she did not move away either, and the not moving was its own kind of speech. The Saturday of the barn social they went to town, and the town watched them come. It watched the way it always watched, the murmur that ran along the lantern-lit wall when the scarred man limped in with the wild widow and her 4 boys scrubbed and combed. Somewhere a woman said monster low enough to carry and high enough to sting. Ezra heard it. Della saw him hear it, saw the old flinch start in the set of his shoulders, the flinch of a man who had spent years shrinking himself so the town would have less of him to hate. And then she watched him decide not to. He straightened. He crossed the plank floor with his uneven stride in front of God and Cottonwood Bend and every whispering soul in it, and he stopped in front of Della Hartwell and held out one broad, scarred hand. "They're going to talk," he said quietly for her alone. "They'll talk whether we give them cause or not. I'd rather give them the cause and have the dance." She put her hand in his. "Then dance," she said. He was slow and he was careful, and the leg cost him. But Ezra Calloway danced with the widow in the middle of the floor while the town watched. And by the second turn, some of the watching had softened into something that was not quite approval but was no longer scorn. And Ruth Baird by the cider table was smiling outright and daring anyone near her to say a word. On the ride home under a sky thick with stars, the boys asleep in the wagon bed, Ezra held the reins loose and Della sat close on the seat against the cold. And he said low, "Della, there's a thing I ought to say to you." And she turned to him with her heart in her throat, and the near declaration hung there between them, one word from spoken, warm as a hand. It was Cole Draper who cut it short. He was waiting where the town road met the Barcy track, on horseback, 2 of Vane's men behind him, and he walked his animal out into the moonlight slow enough to make it a threat. "Evening, Calloway?" Draper's grin was a knife wound. He looked past Ezra into the wagon bed at the sleeping shapes of the boys and let his gaze rest there on purpose. "Fine litter you've took in. Shame how things happen to strays out on the range. Fences, whether a boy wanders off, nobody's fault." He clucked his tongue. "Accidents happen to strays, Calloway. You want to think on that, you and the widow both, before you get too settled." Ezra handed Della the reins. He did not raise his voice. Della had learned by now that the quiet was where the danger lived in him, and he did not hurry. He stepped the horse forward until he was even with Draper, and the moon lay full on the scar. "You see my face," Ezra said. "You know where I got it. There were men bigger than you, Draper, and more of them, and armed better, and they don't none of them draw breath tonight." He let it settle. "You come near one of these boys, you so much as let your shadow fall on them, and I will forget every reason I've got to be a peaceable man. That's not a threat. A threat's a thing a man might not mean. Ride on." For a moment the 2 men held there in the cold. Then Draper's grin thinned and he turned his horse, and he and Vane's men went off up the road at a walk that was meant to look like their own idea. The line was drawn. Ezra took the reins back from Della's hands and found them shaking and closed his own around them, warm and certain, until they stopped. Behind them, Pip stirred in the wagon and murmured something, and Tom's voice, thick with sleep, answered his brother low and settled him. Della looked at the man beside her and at her 4 boys safe in the wagon bed and at the ranch coming up dark and solid against the stars. And for one whole night, before everything that was coming came, it was real, and it was theirs, and it held. Chapter 6, The Note Comes Due. The rider came at midday, and Ezra knew the shape of trouble before he could read the man's face. He was up on the north slope with Tom, restringing the wire drapers kind of men always seem to find loose, and he watched the buggy roll up the wagon track with its yellow wheels flashing in the sun. No working man drove a rig like that. No neighbor come to borrow a harrow. It rolled the way money rolled, easy and certain of its welcome, and Ezra set down his pliers and straightened slow, letting the ache in his hip settle before he trusted the leg. "Who is it?" Tom asked. The boy had grown a habit lately of standing at Ezra's shoulder instead of across from him, and Ezra had not said a word about it for fear of breaking it. "Vane's man of law, most like." Ezra wiped his palms down his thighs. "You go on to the house. Tell your mother to keep the young ones in." Tom did not go. He was 13 and he had buried a father and dragged 3 brothers across half a territory, and he had learned that the men who told you to go inside were the men something bad was about to happen to. Ezra saw it in his jaw and did not press. They walked down together, the boy matching the hitch in Ezra's stride without seeming to. The lawyer was a soft, pink man named Fessler who would not step down from the buggy. He held the papers out over the wheel like he did not want the ranch dust on his boots, and he looked at the scar the way strangers always looked at it, quick and then away, as if it might catch. "Mr. Calloway, I represent the interests of Mr. Silas Vane." He said the name the way a man lays down a winning card. "Mr. Vane has acquired the promissory note held against this property by the Cottonwood Bend Bank. The full sum falls due, principal and the interest accrued." He tapped the page. 30 days from today's date, sir, in full, or the Barcy passes to Mr. Vane by right of the note." Ezra took the paper. His name was on it in the bank's hand, and beneath it, fresh, was Vane's signature, black and broad. The bank had been failing all spring. Everyone knew it. He had told himself he had until autumn to make good, that old Harmon at the bank would carry a neighbor. He had not once let himself think the note could be bought out from under him like a steer at auction. "The bank carried this at reasonable time," Ezra said. His voice came level. It always did. It was the one thing the war had left him whole. Vane calling it all at once. "Mr. Vane is within his rights." "He is." Ezra folded the paper along its creases, careful, and put it inside his coat. "Tell him I had it." Fessler blinked, thrown by getting no fight. He gathered his reins. 30 days, Mr. Calloway." "I'd not waste them." The buggy turned in the yard and rolled back down the track with its yellow wheels flashing, and Ezra stood in the dust and felt the whole shape of the thing at last. How patient Vane had been. How long the man must have been smiling and waiting while the bank rotted. How it had never been about the herd or the grass at all. It was the creek. It had always been the creek, the one live water for 6 miles, and now Vane had found the one lever long enough to pry it loose. He had come home from the war to this ground with nothing but a limp and a face folks crossed the road to spare themselves, and he had made it into something, board by board and calf by calf, alone, when no soul in the valley thought a broken man could hold a ranch. He had believed the work would speak for him even if his face never could. He looked at the empty track where the buggy had gone and understood that the work had never mattered to a man like Vane. Only the water, only the taking. "He can't just take it," Tom said. "It's yours, you built it." He bought the paper the bank had on it. That's the law of the thing. Ezra put his hand on the boy's shoulder and the boy let it stay. "Go tell your mother I'll want to talk to her, not the young ones, just her." Della heard him out at the table with her hands flat on the wood, and Ezra watched the color leave her face and something harder come up under it, the thing that had gotten her and 4 boys across the territory alive. "How much?" she asked. He told her. She did not gasp. She had done sums for a living husband and a dying one both, and she turned this one over quiet, and when she looked up her eyes were wet but her voice was iron. "It's us," she said. "The wage you pay me, the 4 of them eating you down to the bone all winter. You were closer to the edge than you ever let on, and we pushed you over it." She stood. "Ezra, if we weren't here, could you make it?" "Sit down, Della." "Answer me." "No," he said it hard enough to stop her. "You listen. This note's been coming a year. It was coming before your buggy ever climbed my hill. Vane wants my water, and he'd have found his lever whether you were under my roof or not." He leaned in, and the scar pulled white along his cheek the way it did when he meant a thing to the ground. "What he sees now is that I've got something he can squeeze me by. That's the only difference you made. He looks up here and he sees I've got people, and a man with people can be leaned on." His jaw worked. That's not a weakness I'd trade back. Hear me, not for the creek, not for the ranch. She sat down slow. Her hand found the edge of the table again. I could take them, she said, barely aloud, not because she wanted to, but because it had to be said out loud once, laid on the table with the rest of the debt. Go to Ruth, lighten your load, give him no widow and no wild boys to point at. You do that, Ezra said, and he's one without a dollar changing hands. You do that and he's taken the only thing on this place worth the fight. He shook his head once. You're not going anywhere, Della Hartwell. I didn't open my gate to close it behind you the first hard month. She looked at him a long moment. Outside they could hear Amos calling to the calf and Pip's small answering laugh, and We's hollering at both of them, and Tom's low voice trying to keep the peace like a man. Then what do we do, she said, not asking whether they'd fight, asking how. He'd been building the answer all afternoon in the back of his mind, the way he built everything, board by board. The herd, he said. There's a beef contract letting at the railhead, the army buyer coming through end of the month. Vane's been counting on that contract, same as everyone. If I drive early, get there ahead of his stock, get my beeves under the buyer's hand first, a herd this size, top weight, I clear enough to cover the note and better. He turned his cup on the table. It's a long drive to make early. Grass isn't full up. I'd be pushing them thin and fast with too few hands. You've got hands, Della said. You've got 4 of them and me. Something moved in his face that was almost a smile. They're boys. Tom can ride better than half the grown men in this county, and you know it. We's can fix anything with a moving part. Amos will keep every animal you've got on its feet. And Pip, her breath caught. Pip can hand you your coffee and be near you, and that's worth something too. She reached across the table, and this time it was her hand that found his, over the knots and the burn scar on the back of it, and she did not let it be an accident. We are not a load you carry, Ezra, not anymore. You put us to work. He looked down at her hand on his. A man told all his life that no woman would have the look of him, that the scar was a thing to cross the street from. He looked at her fingers laced through his in the plain light of his own kitchen, and had to take a breath before he could speak. All right, he said rough. All right, we drive. Vane did not come himself. Vane never did the ugly part with his own hands. That was what he kept Draper for. But his work showed all the same, quiet as rot. Word went down into Cottonwood Bend within the week, though Ezra never learned the exact mouth that carried it, that the Barcy was finished, that the bank had called its paper, that only a fool would deal with a bankrupt man. When Ezra sent Tom in with a wire to 2 stock buyers who'd bought from him before, both wires came back cold. One had heard the Barcy beef was poorly. The other had simply heard the Barcy was through. Ruth Baird told Della, low over the counter with her eyes on the door, that Silas Vane had stood in her store 2 days running telling anyone who'd listen it was a shame. A real shame. A scarred-up cripple and a wild widow letting a good ranch go to ruin. And wasn't it a mercy someone stood ready to take the land off their hands before those boys burned it down around them? He's not lying about you, Ruth said. He's just saying it so kind it sounds like truth. That's the meanest kind of lie there is, the kind that wears a smile. She pressed a paper twist of penny candy into Della's hand for the boys and would take no coin for it. You go show him wrong, honey. Some of us are watching to see you do it. More than you'd think, though we're a quiet lot in this town and slow to say so out loud. Della carried the words home like coin. It was the first kindness the valley had shown her that did not come with a warning attached, and she found, riding up the hill toward the ranch that had somehow become home, that her eyes were stinging and it was not the dust. They started the gather. 4 days of it, dawn to full dark, Ezra and Tom working the draws while Wees rode the flats and Amos doctored the footsore, and Della kept a camp that fed them all and never once complained. The herd came together on the home bottom above the creek, bawling and dusty, and Ezra let himself believe near enough to ready. He counted them at dusk on the 5th night, and the number came up good. Better than good. Enough. He slept 4 hours and woke to Tom shaking him, and the gray light wrong somehow. Too much room in it. The section of drift fence along the lower creek had been cut. Not fallen. Cut clean through, 3 spans of wire lying coiled in the grass where a man had bent and clipped it in the dark and walked his horse quiet through the gap. And the herd, the gathered herd, 4 days of work, had drifted and scattered through the breach in the night, out across the open range and up into the broken country where it would take a week to bring them back in. Ezra stood at the cut wire with the coil in his hand. He did not curse. He turned it over and saw where the pliers had bit, a workman's cut, A hired cut, and he thought of Draper's flat eyes in town and the thing the man had said about accidents happening to strays. Behind him, the sun came up hard and clean on 22 days, and a herd gone to the wind, and no other rode out. "Get your brothers," he said to Tom, and his voice was still level as ever. "And bring the horses, all of them. We're not done." Chapter 7, Everything We Have. The morning came up gray and cold over the Barcy, and by the time the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, every soul on the ranch was already in the saddle or on foot in the brush, chasing cattle out of the coulees where Draper's cut fence had let them wander. Ezra had said it plain the night before, standing in the lamplight of the kitchen with the ledger closed and his hat in his 2 hands. "We've got 11 days. We drive what we can gather to the railhead, we sell, and we take the money to the bank before Vane's note comes due. If we come up short—" He had stopped there. He was not a man to promise what he could not carry, and he would not lie to a woman who had been lied to enough. "Then we come up short together," Della had said, and that had been the whole of it. Now she rode a borrowed mare with her skirts pinned up and her hair coming loose, and she found she did not care about either. Ahead of her, Tom worked a draw like a man twice his 13 years, turning a knot of steers with a coiled rope and a low, steady voice that Ezra had taught him. The boy had not slept much. None of them had, but there was a set to Tom's shoulders now that had not been there a month ago, back when he'd been the angry man of a house with no man in it. "Push him easy," Ezra called across the flat. He rode stiff, his bad leg cocked in the stirrup, but he rode. "Don't run the weight off 'em. Every pound is $1, and every dollar is the roof over your heads." "Yes, sir," Tom called back and did not sass him, and Della marked that too. By midday they had better than 40 head bunched in the home pasture, and the boys came in dusty and starved and glowing. Amos had a scrape down one cheek where a bull calf had swung its head, and he wore it like a medal. Wheeze had rigged a whistle from a willow reed and used it to turn stock, which had actually worked, and he could not stop telling everyone so. Even little Pip had a job. Ezra had set the 5-year-old on the top rail of the corral with a switch of green cottonwood and told him he was the gatekeeper, that no cow got past him, and Pip had taken the charge with the terrible seriousness of a small boy given something real to guard. He waved the switch. The cattle ignored him utterly. It did not matter. His face was fierce with purpose. "He hasn't cried once all day," Della said quietly, coming to stand beside Ezra at the rail. Ezra watched the boy a moment. The scar down the side of his face pulled when he almost smiled, the way it always did, as though the war had left him only half the room to do it in. "Man's got work, he's got no time for crying," he said. "Learned that myself." "Is that what this is for you, work?" He looked at her then, and for once he did not look away first. "No," he said, "it isn't." She felt the word go into her like warmth into cold hands, aching before it eased. She had not been looked at that way in a long time, not since before the fever took Jonah, not truly. She had told herself she was past being looked at. Used up, the town said, a widow with 4 mouths, and she had half believed it. But this scarred, quiet man looked at her as though she were the first clean thing he had seen in years. "We should get back to it," she said, because she was afraid, and he let her be afraid and turned back to the cattle. They worked till dark and past it. When they finally stopped, they stopped where they stood at a fire near the gather ground, too far and too tired to trek back to the house. Della fed them out of a Dutch oven beans and salt pork and pan bread scorched at the edges, and the boys ate like wolves and fell asleep almost mid-sentence, rolled in blankets in a heap the way pups sleep. Tom lasted longest, sitting up by the fire with a man's pride, until Ezra said, "Sleep, son." "I've got the watch," and the boy went down like a felled tree at the word son. Then it was only the 2 of them, and the low red coals. For a while neither spoke. The cattle shifted and lowed in the dark. Somewhere a coyote tried its voice and thought better of it. "You should rest that leg," Della said at last. "It rests when I'm dead." He said it without self-pity, a plain fact, and poked the fire. The light ran up the ruined side of his face. She had stopped seeing the scar as the town saw it weeks ago. Now it was only the map of him. "You did good today," he said. "You and the boys both. I've hired grown men couldn't have gathered what those 4 did." "They'd do anything for you," she hesitated. "You know that, don't you?" He was quiet. Ezra, she had never once used only his name before. It had always been Mr. or Sir or the careful distance of an employer. It came out of her now soft as a hand laid flat. "Whatever happens with the note, whatever comes." I need you to know they'd do anything for you, and so would." She stopped. Her courage, which had carried her across 100 slammed doors, failed her here. He looked into the fire. When he spoke, it was slow, the way he laid fence, one true post at a time. "The town told you about me before you ever drove out here," he said. "I know how they tell it. The monster on the Barcy, face like that, no woman would have him, wouldn't take the boys, wouldn't take anybody." He turned the word over. "That's what they said." "They were wrong." "Was they?" "They were wrong about everything." She was leaning toward him now, fierce, the same fierceness she spent on her sons. "You are the only man in that whole valley who opened his gate to us, not because we were easy. God knows we weren't. You took 4 wild boys nobody wanted and a woman nobody wanted, and you never once raised your hand, and you gave my sons something no schoolmaster or preacher ever gave them, which was the notion that they were worth the raising. So don't you tell me what the town said. I know what the town said. The town is a pack of fools." He was very still. The fire snapped. "They said things about you too," he said finally. "Lo, in town, that the widow was used up, that she was hard and proud and dragging 4 brats to ruin." His jaw worked. "First time I heard it, I wanted to put a man through a window, me who hasn't wanted anything in 10 years. He shook his head. "They were wrong. You're the finest thing that ever came through that gate, Della, you and them boys. I've thought it every day and been too much a coward to say it. A man looks like I look, he learns to keep his wanting quiet." She reached across the little space between them and took his hand, the big scarred hand that had mended and carved and never struck, and held it in both of hers. "Keep it quiet then," she whispered, "but don't keep it from me." He turned his hand over so that hers lay in it, small and rough with the day's work, and he closed his fingers around it slow, the way a man closes his hand on something he means to keep. Neither of them said the whole of it. Not yet. But it hung there in the firelight between them, half-spoken, aching, more than a promise and not quite a vow, and it was enough to carry them into the dark. They drove for 2 days more and gathered near 100 head, and Ruth Baird sent word by her boy that a buyer from the North Spread would meet the drive at the railhead and pay top dollar cash. For the first time, the arithmetic bent toward hope. Ezra sat up one night with the stub of a pencil and figured it 3 times over and said, "It's not the whole note, but it's near enough that a reasonable bank would carry the rest." He did not say what they both knew, that the bank was not the bank anymore. The bank was Silas Vane. And Vane, it turned out, had done his figuring too. Marshall Boone rode out on the 4th morning with his hat in his hand and bad news in his mouth. Vane had gone to the recorder's office and dug up a technicality in the old deed, a clause about the water rights on the creek, filed loose 30 years back, and filed a challenge that froze the ranch's standing until it cleared a judge. No bank, Boone said, not even an honest one, would take a partial payment against a note on land whose title was in dispute. "He's not trying to collect the debt," Ezra said, and his voice had gone flat and dangerous. "He never was. He wants the creek, and he wants it clean, and he means to have the whole thing or burn it to the ground." "That's the size of it," Boone admitted. "I'm sorry, Ezra, I'll do what the law lets me." But Vane's got most of the law bought. Worse came the same afternoon, and it came in the shape of Wees running up from the lower field with Amos stumbling behind him, and both boys white and shaking. Wees had a split lip. Amos had the print of a man's hand rising red across his throat. Della was on her knees in front of them before Ezra had crossed half the yard. "Who did this?" "Who?" "Draper," Wees got out. "Cole Draper. He come on us at the creek where we was watering the horses, grabbed Amos up by the neck and—" He stopped, and his eyes went to Ezra, and there was a terrible thing in them, a child learning that the world would put its hands on him and there might be no help for it. "He said to tell you. He said tell the widow to take her strays and run, on account of accidents happen to strays. He said next time it won't be a warning." Amos had not spoken. He only stared, one hand at his throat, and it was that silence out of the boy who loved every dumb animal on the place, that silence more than the marks, that made something in Ezra's face close like a door slamming. He knelt, he was gentle. He turned Amos's chin with one finger and looked at the marks and said, so quiet the boys had to lean in, "Nobody is going to put a hand on you again. You hear me? Not that man, not Vane, not anybody living. That's my word, and you've seen how I keep it." Amos nodded, his eyes filled. Ezra pulled the boy into his chest and held him, and held Wees with the other arm, and Della folded over all of them, and for a long moment the family knelt together in the dirt, breathing. That was the night the barn burned. Della woke to the light of it before she woke to the sound, the window gone orange, the whole yard leaping and shivering with it. Then the roar reached her, and the cattle's terror, and she was up and out on the porch in her nightdress screaming the boys' names. The gathered herd, 100 head, near enough to save them, was already breaking. 100 half-wild animals crazed by fire and smoke, tearing the corral rails to splinters and pouring out into the black prairie in every direction at once, and the money hope pouring out with them into the dark where no man could gather it back before the note came due. Ezra came out of the smoke on foot, a lariat in his hand and his face lit red, roaring at the boys to get back from the horses, and behind him the barn stood up against the night like a burning church. He got one look at Della on the porch, and one at the cattle streaming away over the ridge, and she saw him understand in a single instant everything they had lost. Then he turned back into the fire because Pip's dog was still in the barn, and the boy was screaming for it, and Ezra Calloway had never in his life let a child cry over a thing he might yet save. Chapter 8, The Longest Night. The barn was a low red animal in the dark, and it was dying. Ezra Calloway saw it that way even as he limped through the smoke, a thing that had sheltered his stock and his hopes for 11 years now folding in on itself, ribs of blackened timber showing through the flame. The heat pushed at him like a hand on the chest. Behind him, the yard was a chaos of dropped buckets and screaming horses, and somewhere over the roar he could hear Della calling names into the night, one after another, her voice climbing higher each time she did not get an answer. Tom, Wesley Amos. They came out of the smoke one at a time, coughing, faces streaked black. Tom half-carried Amos, who had gone back for the sick calf and would not leave it. We stumbled after, a wet sack pressed over his mouth the way Ezra had taught him only that afternoon, a lifetime ago. 3. Ezra counted them the way he had once counted men after a shell fell, quick, cold, praying. 3 boys and Della. There should have been 5. Pip, he said. Della turned. In the firelight her face was a thing he would remember all his life, the moment hope left it. He was by me, she said. He was right by me, Ezra. He had my skirt in his hand. She spun toward the barn, toward the flames, and Ezra caught her around the waist before she could take a step into that furnace. He ain't in there, Ezra said. Della, look at me. That calf pen's on the far side and it's whole yet. If he ran out, not in. A boy runs from fire, he don't run to it. He said it plain and certain because she needed something to stand on and because he needed to believe it himself. But even as the words left him, he was scanning the dark past the light, the black rim of the world beyond the burning, and a cold older than the war settled into his gut. Because he had seen the riders. Not clear, not to swear to, but when the first flames had gone up, there had been the shape of horses at the tree line where no horse of his should be, and the flat crack that had scattered the herd had not been thunder. Someone had lit this. Someone had waited until the whole family was awake and frantic, then ridden off in the confusion, and a small, silent boy who clung to skirts made no sound at all when a hand closed over his mouth. Tom, Ezra said, the herd. The boy's eyes were wet and furious. Gone, run north through the cut fence. I couldn't, his voice broke. I couldn't turn him, I tried. You did right staying whole. Ezra put his hand on Tom's neck, one hard grip. You hear me? You did right. Then low so Della would not hear, did you see riders? Tom went still. Something passed between the man and the boy, some grim adult understanding that had no business in a 13-year-old's face. 2, Tom whispered. Maybe 3, west side. One of 'em rode heavy in the saddle, big shoulders, he swallowed. Like Draper. Ezra shut his eyes for one heartbeat. Cole Draper, Vane's man. The one who had crowded these boys in the street and said accidents happened to strays and smiled saying it. The barn gave a groan and the roof fell in a fountain of sparks, and the horses in the corral screamed, and there was no more time for standing still. They worked the rest of that night like the damned. There was no saving the barn. They gave it up and turned everything to keeping the fire from the house, wet blankets and creek buckets in a chain, 4 boys and a woman and 1 scarred man moving in the orange dark. Twice Ezra went down on the bad leg and got up again. Once a beam let go where Amos stood frozen watching his calf, and Ezra crossed the yard faster than a lame man had any right to and threw them both clear, and the timber came down where the child had been. It caught Ezra across the old ruin of his back, the wounds the war had left him, and something long-heeled tore, and he felt the warm wetness spread under his shirt and said nothing. By the gray hour before dawn the fire was a bed of coals, and the house still stood, and little Pip was still gone. They gathered in the kitchen because there was nowhere else. Della had the boys around the table, and she was doing what she had always done, which was to keep her hands moving so her heart could not catch her, wetting a cloth for Amos's burned wrist, wiping soot from Wee's face, and all the while her eyes going to the black square of the window as if the small boy might walk out of the dark and put his hand in her skirt again. Ezra stood by the door with his coat still on, and blood he was hiding drying stiff down his back, and he made himself say the thing. He didn't wander off, he said. The kitchen went quiet. I saw riders, Tom saw riders. He held Della's eyes. I think Draper took him. I think Vane means to break us this last inch, and he's using a 5-year-old boy to do it. For a moment Della did not move at all. Then she sat down slowly as though her strings had been cut, and put her fist against her mouth, and she did not scream and she did not weep, and that was worse than either. Then it's true, she said into her knuckles. Everything I feared. She lowered her hand and looked up at him, and her face was terrible with a grief that had gone past tears into something flat and final. It's us, Ezra, it was always us. You had a ranch, you had a life, thin as it was yours, and no man burned your barn or cut your fence or stole your baby. The word cracked, and she rode over it. Until you opened your gate to a widow no one wanted and 4 boys no one would take. Vane doesn't want your creek half so much as he wants a lever, and we are the lever. We are the crack he pushes on. As long as we're here, he'll never stop, because hurting us is how he hurts you. Della, I should have known better. She stood again, restless, ruined. The whole town told me, and I stopped my ears because you were kind, and I was so tired, and I let myself. She stopped. She pressed both hands flat on the table. If I take them and go, he has no reason. He gets his lever back and he lets Pip go and he leaves you your ranch. That's the sum of it. I've always been good at sums. Her mouth twisted. I leave and you're safe and my boy comes home. No, Ezra did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But the word came out of him with the flat weight of a dropped stone, and it stopped her. You run tonight, you're running with 3 boys through country crawling with Vane's men, and you're leaving the 4th in Draper's hands, trusting that the man who burned my barn will keep a bargain. That's not a sum, Della. That's a prayer with your children as the stake. She had no answer for that, and he saw it land, and he hated that he had to be the one to take even that thin hope from her. He turned away because he could not bear her face, and he looked at his own hands in the lamplight, big, scarred, shaking now with more than cold. And in the turning, something in him that had held for 11 years quietly gave way. Because she was right about part of it, that was the poison in it. The town had told him too, hadn't it, and for longer than they'd told her. Told him with their turned backs and their hands over their children's eyes when he rode in. Told him no woman would have the monster with the melted face and the dragging leg. He had believed it so long it had become the shape of his life. He had let himself forget he believed it, these last warm months at a full table with a woman's laughter in his kitchen and 4 boys learning to trust him. He had let himself want it. And here was the world come to collect for his wanting, come to say what it had always said, that a man like you doesn't get to keep a thing, that everything you reach for you ruin. Look at the barn, look at the empty chair, look at the small shoes by the door with no boy in them. He had had no right. That was the black thought, the one that had waited in him all his life and finally had its night. He had no right to want them, and now a 5-year-old was paying his debt in the dark. Ezra. He did not turn. I'm all right. You're bleeding through your coat. Tom's voice, not a boy's now, low and hard. Been bleeding since the barn. I saw the beam take you and I saw you get up like it was nothing, and it wasn't nothing. A chair scraped. The boy came around into his sight and planted himself there, and his jaw was set exactly the way Ezra's own got set. You threw yourself under a falling roof for Amos. You didn't even think on it. He's 8, Ezra said. Any man would. No, Tom's eyes were bright and furious and unashamed. No, that ain't so. My whole life men didn't. Men saw 4 of us coming and they shut the gate. You're the only one ever ran toward us instead of off. He was crying now openly, the way he had not let himself cry since his father died. So don't you stand there thinking whatever it is you're thinking. I know that face. Ma gets it, I get it. It's the face that says get gone before you break something worse. And I'm telling you no. Behind him, Weez had come to his feet, and Amos with his burned wrist, and even Amos had his chin up. And Della stood with her hand pressed to her breastbone, watching her eldest son say the thing she had been too frightened to say. And Ezra watched the thing move through her too, watched her come back from the flat, far country of her grief. He carved Pip a horse, Amos said suddenly, fierce and small. Pip sleeps with it. Pip said his first word to him. You're gonna leave. You're gonna let Pip wake up wherever he is and think nobody's coming. Nobody's leaving, Tom said. He turned to his mother. We're not leaving, and we're not letting them take him and keep him, are we? It was not a question. He had learned from Ezra how a man says a true thing, flat, certain, no room in it for argument. Della crossed the kitchen. She took Ezra's face in both her hands, the scarred cheek and the whole one, the way no one in his life had ever held it, and she made him look at her. I was going to run, she said, because I've spent so long believing I was a burden that I couldn't see straight. But I'm looking at you now, Ezra Calloway, and I'm looking at my sons standing up in a burned yard for a man the whole world told them to fear, and I'm not confused anymore. Her thumbs moved over the ruined skin as though it were nothing, as though it were dear. You are the only man who ever chose us. I'm not going to punish you for it by leaving, and I'm not leaving my baby out in the dark for one more minute than I have to. Something in Ezra's chest that had been closed since a field in the war came slowly, painfully open. He put his hand over hers on his face. Then he straightened, and the movement pulled the torn place in his back, and he let it hurt and did not hide it this time. All right, he said quietly. And then to the room in the low, sovereign voice he used so seldom that when it came, the boys went still to hear it. Now you listen to me, all of you. Vane thinks he's fighting a lame man and a widow. He thinks a thing that's been kicked stays down. He looked at each of them, Tom, Wheeze, Amos, Della, and last at the small, empty chair. He's about to learn different. We're not running. We're going to get Pip back, and we're going to keep this land. And when it's done, every soul in Cottonwood Bend is going to know exactly whose these boys are, and exactly what happens to a man that lays hands on what's mine. Outside, the sky over the eastern hills was going from black to bruised gray. The longest night was ending. Ezra Calloway reached for his rifle above the door, and this time when he limped across the floor, he did not try to hide it at all. Chapter 9, Mine to Keep. The tracks led east, toward Vane's land, and Ezra Calloway read them the way other men read scripture. He knelt in the gray hour before dawn with the burned smell of the barn still in his clothes, and he set 2 fingers against the print of a small boot in the churned mud. Little Pip's boot. He knew the size of it because he had cut the leather himself and stitched it, and knelt to lace it more mornings than he could count. Beside that small print ran the deeper heel of a grown man's stride, dragging, hurrying. Draper, carrying the boy or driving him. He went willing part of the way, Ezra said low. Then he didn't. He touched the deeper gouge where the small heels had dug in, where the boy had set his feet and been dragged anyway. Right about here he understood. Behind him, Tom's breath came hard. The boy had not slept, none of them had, and the firelight of the ruined barn still flickered orange against the low clouds. 13 years old and standing like a man twice that, jaw set, a coil of rope over his shoulder because Ezra had told him to bring it and he had not asked why. Then we go get him, Tom said. Marshal Boone swung down off his horse with the slow care of an old man who had done this too many times. He looked at the tracks, and he looked at Ezra's face, at the scar that split it, at the leg that would not fully straighten, and something moved behind his tired eyes that might have been shame for every year the town had spent afraid of the wrong man. That's Vane's ground past the creek, Boone said. I go on there without cause, Vane's lawyers make it disappear. You've got cause, Ezra rose. It cost him. The wounds he'd torn pulling Amos clear of the flames had opened again under the bandages, and he felt the warm seep of them against his ribs, and he did not let it show on his face. A 5-year-old boy taken in the night. Ride behind me if you want it clean, but I'm going. Boone held his eyes a moment, then he nodded once and mounted up. They rode. Vane kept his cattle in the low pasture, and his secrets in the line shack above it, a squat cabin of gray board with one window and a stovepipe leaning crooked against the sky. Smoke came from the pipe. Ezra saw it from the ridge and felt the whole of him go quiet and cold, the old war quiet, the stillness that had come over him in the ravine years ago when he'd carried 3 men out under fire and earned the ruin of his face for it. Tom, he kept his voice down. You hold the horses in the draw, you hear shooting, you ride for Ruth Baird's and no place else. No, the boy's chin came up. He's my brother. He is. Ezra looked at him, and there was no anger in it, only the flat weight of a man who had decided a thing. And you're mine to keep alive, both of you, hold the horses. Tom's mouth worked. Then he took the reins. Ezra passed him, because in the weeks since a scarred man had opened his gate, Tom had learned the difference between an order and a promise, and this was both. Ezra and the marshal went down on foot through the wet grass. They were 20 yards from the shack when the door banged open, and Cole Draper came out with little Pip by the collar. The boy hung from the big man's fist like a kitten, boots not touching the ground, his small face white and blank the way it had been the first night at the Barcy, before Ezra had carved him a horse from pine and coaxed the first word out of him in a month. Silent Pip, gone silent again all the way down, his eyes fixed on nothing. "That's far enough, Calloway." Draper's other hand rested on the pistol at his hip. "Knew you'd come sniffing, told Vane you would, a man like you." His lip curled at the scar. "Can't leave what ain't yours." "Set him down," Ezra said. "Or what?" Draper laughed, but it did not reach his eyes. "You'll limp at me." Behind Draper in the doorway, Silas Vane appeared, clean coat, clean hands, that easy smile he wore like a second face. "Ezra," he said, warm as a neighbor across a fence. "You've had a hard night, barn's a loss, I hear, terrible thing of fire. This is how it ends for men who won't sell, everything just slips away from them. Now you take your marshal and go home, and maybe the boy walks back to you by supper. Push me, and he doesn't." The smile widened. "I'm a reasonable man." For a moment no one moved. The wind came up off the creek and turned the grass silver. Then little Pip, hanging from Draper's fist, found Ezra's face across the yard, and he did the thing he had done 100 times in the safe, warm dark of the bunkhouse. He reached. One small hand, opening toward the scarred man, the way a child reaches in his sleep for the one who will be there. "Pa," Pip said. The word broke something loose in Ezra's chest and set something else to stone. He was moving before Draper's gun cleared leather. 20 yards on a ruined leg, and he crossed it like a young man, like a whole man, because the leg had never been the truth of him. Draper got the pistol up, and Ezra took the wrist in one hand and turned it toward the sky, and the shot went wide into the low clouds. And with his other arm, he swept Pip out of the big man's grip and thrust him back and down into the grass. "Stay down, son." And then there was nothing between Ezra Calloway and the man who had taken his boy. Draper was bigger, Draper was whole. It did not matter. Ezra had carried men out of worse than this on a leg that would not bend, and he had done it for strangers. This was his son in the grass behind him. Ezra hit him the way the war had taught him, short and driving and without heat, and Draper went back into the doorframe, and the second blow folded him, and the third put him in the mud. The big man surged up once with murder in his eyes and a knee driving for the ruined leg, the leg every man in the county thought was the weak place in Ezra Calloway, and Ezra turned it aside and took him down again and pinned the knife hand flat in the muck. Ezra came down over him with a fist raised and every torn wound in his side screaming, and his whole life of being called monster gathered up behind his arm. And he stopped, held it, breathing, Draper's face beneath him, bloodied, one arm up against the blow that had not come. "No," Ezra said to himself as much as the man. "The boys are watching, and they'll know what a man does with a mercy." He rose off him. Draper lay in the mud and looked up at the scarred face bent over him, the face that had shown him mercy, and something in the foreman came apart. Fear, maybe, or the plain sight of what he'd made himself into. "It was Vane," he choked out loud, spitting. "All of it. The fences we cut, the barn, he paid me to fire the barn, the water hole, the boy, all of it him. I ain't hanging for a rich man's want." He twisted in the mud toward Boone. "You heard it, Marshal, you heard me." "I heard you," Boone said quietly. His gun was out now, and it was pointed not at Ezra and not at Draper. It was pointed at Silas Vane. Vane's smile had finally gone. He stood in the doorway with his clean hands empty and his mouth working around words that would not come. And for the first time, the town's great man had the look of what he'd always been underneath, small and cornered, and out of people to hire. "Silas Vane," Boone said, and his old voice did not shake. "Arson, the theft of a child. I've had a belly full of watching you buy this county a piece at a time, hands where I see them." Ezra did not hear the rest of it. He was already on his knees in the wet grass, gathering little Pip up out of the mud, and the boy came into his arms and clung with all four small limbs, shaking, his face buried in the burn-smelling collar of Ezra's coat. And here came Tom down the slope at a dead run, having heard the shot and obeyed nothing. Thank God, Tom skidding to his knees beside them and pulling his little brother half into his own lap, saying his name over and over, *Pip, Pip, I got you, I'm here. And then over the ridge the others. Della first, her skirts gathered in her fists, her hair come loose, her face a wound of terror. She had not been able to stay behind at the ruined ranch, of course she hadn't, and Wheeze and Amos ran at her heels with the horses lathered behind them. She saw them in the grass. She saw Pip alive in Ezra's arms, and the sound that came out of her was not a word. She reached them and fell down among them and took her smallest son's face in both her hands and could not speak, only pressed her forehead to his, breathing him in. They were all of them there then, in the trampled grass with the gray dawn breaking over Vane's stolen land, Della and her 4 boys and the scarred man who had opened his gate. Tom with his arms still hard around Pip, Wheeze white-faced and Amos crying without shame. Pip's small hand knotted in Ezra's coat and not letting go. Ezra looked at them, at every one, and he did the thing he had never let himself do, never in all the weeks of held glances and brushed hands, never in the long nights of telling himself a man with his face had no right to want a family. He let himself want it, out loud. In the whisper, he'd been saving his whole ruined life. He drew them in one arm, gathering Pip and Amos, his hand reaching to close over Della's and Tom's shoulder, and Wheeze leaning into his side, until the whole trembling knot of them was under his arms, and he bent his scarred face over the middle of them and spoke low, so low it was meant for no one but them. A thing said the way a man sets his hand to a Bible. "Listen to me now." His voice shook and then it steadied, and when it steadied it was iron. "You're mine, every one of you, not for the land can go, not for the wage or the work. You're mine because I chose you, and I go on choosing you, and there is no man living who will ever take you from me again." His thumb moved over the back of Della's hand. His eyes found hers and did not flinch from her or from himself. "Della Hartwell, I'm your husband if you'll have me. These 4 are my sons from this hour, and they carry my name, and God help the man who says a word against them." He looked down at the small face pressed to his coat. "You hear me, Pip? You called me Pa, I'll answer to it the rest of my days." Della was weeping. She turned her hand under his and gripped it hard enough to hurt, and she said, yes, and pressed the word into his knuckles. Tom did not say anything at all. He only leaned his head against the scarred man's arm, the man of the house at last permitted to be a boy, and let it rest there. Behind them, the marshal was binding Sela's Vane's clean hands with the rope off Tom's saddle, and the sun was coming up red and clean over the creek that Vane had wanted so badly and would never own now. But Ezra Calloway did not turn to watch his enemy fall. He had a boy to carry home and a family under his arm, and for the first time since the war had marked him a thing to be feared, the scarred man held everything he wanted and held it fast and did not let go. Chapter 10, The Name They Carry. The paper that had nearly cost them everything took less than an hour to die. Marshal Boone laid it flat on the counter of Ruth Baird's store, where half of Cottonwood Bend had crowded in out of the cold to watch. The note that Sela's Vane had bought from the failing bank, the note he had called due to break them, sat there with its fine ink and its cruel figures, and beside it the ledger Cole Draper had handed over rather than hang alone. The foreman had talked plenty once the cell door shut. He had named the night the fence was cut. He had named the barn and the coal oil and the hand that carried little Pip off into the dark. "A note bought with fraud money," Boone said, tapping it, "and used to threaten a man off his own water isn't worth the paper, banks calling it void. The judge in Ellsworth agrees." He looked up at Ezra over the rims of his spectacles. "The Barcy is yours, Calloway, clear." "Has been all along." Ezra Calloway stood with his hat in his scarred hands and did not say anything for a long moment. Della watched the muscle work in his jaw, watched the thing he had carried since the war, and since the note came due finally set itself down. When he spoke it was low, the way he said everything that mattered. "Obliged, Marshal." "Don't thank me," Boone said. "I let that man run this town 3 years too long." He folded the note and put it in his coat like something he meant to burn. "Thank them." He nodded at the store full of people, the same people who had turned Della and 4 boys away from every door a season ago. Ruth Baird was already untying her apron. "The barn goes up Saturday," she announced, to the room and to no one, in the voice of a woman who would brook no argument. "Wendell's bringing his team and the good lumber. Mrs. Ackley's doing the dinner. Anybody who ever said a hard word about that family can come swing a hammer and say a kind one instead." She fixed her eye on a rancher by the stove who had, in another life, shut his gate in Della's face. He took off his hat. They raised the barn on a bright, cold Saturday, and the whole valley came. Della stood at the edge of the new yard with a coffee pot going cold in her hands and could not, for a while, make herself move. She had spent a lifetime being looked at as a burden, a used-up widow with 4 wild sons, a thing to be moved along before winter. Now the wagons came up the Barcy Road one after another, and men she had never spoken to were setting the great corner posts, and women were laying planks of pie across two sawhorses, and the sound of it, the hammers, the calling, the ring of the crosscut saw, was the sound of a town that had decided, late and all at once, to be ashamed of itself and do better. Tom worked the high beams with the men, 13 and lean and sure of his rope, and no one told him to get down. Wesley had the millwrights cornered, explaining a thing about the water-wheel gearing that made two grown men scratch their heads and then, slowly, nod. Amos had a poultice on a workhorse that had gashed its leg on a nail, crooning to it, and the horse stood for him. And little Pip, who had come to them silent as a stone, who had clung to Della's skirt out of pure animal fear. Pip was up on Ezra's shoulders directing the whole affair, pointing where a board should go, shouting instructions no one followed, and everyone cheered. Ezra had built and rebuilt in his head 100 times what it would cost to raise that barn alone, the weeks of it, the money he did not have, the winter that would beat him to the ridgepole. He had not once figured on this, on the valley arriving at his gate uninvited, on hands he had never shaken hauling his rafters up, on the low, steady friendliness of men who had, until this month, crossed the street to keep from meeting his eye. He worked among them and said little, because saying little was his nature. But Della saw how he stood a fraction straighter every hour, how the wariness he wore like a second scar eased off him board by board. "You've got a foreman up there?" Ruth said, coming up beside Della. "I've got 4 of them." Della's voice did something, and she pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth. "Ruth, 6 weeks ago you told me there was one man who might take us, just the one." "I did." "You could have said no, everybody else did." Ruth watched Ezra cross the yard with the boy still riding him, watched him stop and steady a wall the men were tipping up, put his shoulder into it, his bad leg braced and holding. "I knew Ezra Calloway before the war," she said. "Kindest boy in this county." Came home with his face changed and his walk changed, and everyone decided the inside had changed too. It hadn't. I just had to wait a long time for somebody to find it out. She squeezed Della's arm. "You found it out. Go on. Pour the man some coffee." They married on the ranch 2 weeks later, under a sky washed clean by the first hard rain of the season, with the new barn standing red and raw and finished behind them. There was no church for it. The town preacher offered, stammering half apology in it, and Ezra declined without heat. "We'll do it here," he said, "on the ground we kept." So they did it on the ground they kept in front of the house, with the creek that Sela's vein had wanted so badly running bright and unbothered below. Della wore a dress Ruth had cut down and Della had sewn back up by lamplight, and she came out of the house on Tom's arm, because Tom had asked to be the one, quiet and fierce, the man of the house handing off the last of that weight for good. The 4 boys stood up with them in a row, Tom, Wheeze, Amos, and Pip at the end in a shirt too big, holding the small carved horse Ezra had whittled for him back when the boy would not yet speak, holding it now not out of fear, but because it was his and he liked to have it. Ezra stood in a clean coat with the scar down his face plain in the daylight, and he did not hide it, and no one looked away, and it did not matter. When the words came round to him, he said them clear enough for the front row to hear, and low enough that it was still, somehow, only for her. "I take you," he said. "You and every one of these boys. I already did months back. This is just so the county knows it." Della laughed and wept at once. "The county," she said, "can mind its business." "It can," Ezra agreed and kissed his wife. The boys made a great noise. Ruth Baird cried into a handkerchief the size of a flour sack. Marshall Boone, who had come out in his Sunday collar, said afterward it was the first wedding in 20 years he'd stayed sober enough to remember, and he meant it as a compliment. And when it was done, when the little crowd of neighbors had eaten Mrs. Ackley's dinner and toasted them with cider, and started their wagons home in the long gold light, Ezra found Tom standing off by the corral fence, looking at nothing. Ezra went and stood beside him the way he had learned to do, no questions, just there. "My pa would have liked this," Tom said finally. "The ranch, you." He worked a splinter of fence rail with his thumbnail. "I used to think if I let anybody stand in his place I was letting him go, losing him twice." "You're not losing him," Ezra said. "A man can carry 2 fathers, one who gave him his start and one who'll see him the rest of the way. There's room." I'd know. He had never spoken to the boy of the men he'd carried out of the fire, the ones whose faces he still saw, but Tom seemed to hear the whole of it anyway. "Reckon there is," Tom said, and after a while he leaned just slightly into Ezra's arm and let it hold him up. Winter came on gentle that year, or seemed to. The Barcy did not become rich. It became something better and rarer, which was enough. The herd came through the cold with only ordinary losses. Wesley's mill turned again. He had puzzled out the broken gearing that had beaten Ezra for 2 years, and the boy ran it now like it was his own, grinding for half the small outfits in the valley and taking a cut that he kept in a tin and guarded like a banker. Amos had a growing string of ailing creatures brought to his door. A rancher 4 miles off had ridden over in the sleet to fetch the Callaway boy who fixes stock. And Amos had gone, 8 years old and grave as a doctor, and had not been wrong yet. Tom worked the range beside Ezra as a partner, and was in the evenings gloriously and finally just a boy, sleeping late on a Sunday, losing at checkers, laughing so hard at his own brother's foolishness that he fell off the bench. The thing that had aged his face at the dinner table months ago, the man he had made himself be too young, had loosened and let go. Ezra carried the ranch now. Tom was allowed to carry nothing heavier than his own rope, and he had never in his life been so glad of anything. And Pip talked. Lord, how Pip talked once the dam broke, a running river of questions from waking to sleeping, about horses and stars, and whether God had a scar too, and why the creek ran downhill and never uphill. He still climbed into Ezra's lap of an evening, but it was not the old grip anymore, the drowning clutch of a child who expected the floor to fall away. It was just a boy who had found the warmest place in the house and meant to keep it. Sela's Vane went to Ellsworth in irons and did not come back. Cole Draper turned state's evidence and drew a lighter sentence and left the country the day he was let go, and no one in Cottonwood Bend spoke his name again except to say good riddance. The creek stayed the Barcees. The water Vane had schemed and burned and stolen a child to get ran on down through Ezra's land in the spring melt, indifferent to all of it, feeding the grass that fed the cattle that kept them. On a night deep in that first winter of the new name, they sat all 6 at the supper table, close in the lamplight with the wind shut out. Della watched them from her end, the plates near clean, Wheeze and Amos arguing some point of no importance. Tom leaned back full and easy, Pip fighting sleep with his cheek going soft against the table's edge. She caught Ezra's eye down the length of it. The scar the town had feared, the market had called monstrous, sat in the warm light now as what it truly was. The sign of a man who had once run into fire to carry other men out, and who had done it again, older and slower and no less sure, for a boy he had chosen. He reached over and gathered Pip up before the child could fall, tucked him against his shoulder the way he'd done at the barn raising, the way he seemed made to do. The boy sighed and did not wake. Ezra looked round the table at the rest of them, the ones who had been turned from every door, the ones no man in the county would take, and he said the thing again, the low and sovereign thing he had first whispered over them in the dark on Vane's land the night they got Pip back. Mine, he said, quiet, just for the 6 of them and the walls that held them. Every one of you, mine to keep. Ours, Della said. Ours, he allowed, and the word settled over the table like a blanket. Outside, the wind ran on down the valley and could not get in. Inside, the family that the town had said would never be a family finished its supper and banked the fire, and went up to bed under one roof they had fought for and would not lose. At dawn the Barcy stood quiet in the pale light, smoke rising straight from the chimney, the new barn red against the frost, the creek running clear. In the bunkroom 4 boys slept, safe and warm and carrying, all 4 of them, the name of the only man who ever chose them, Callaway. And they would carry it well, and they would carry it a long time, and no one ever again would take them from him.